back, guys. Today we are doing a video on you can either consider this rebuilding a CV or how to build a long travel CV. I'm building long travel CVs, but the only difference between rebuilding a CV and building a long travel CV is you most likely don't have to knock the axle shaft out. So if you're looking at like rebooting a CV, this will also work for that. Just ignore the part where you knock the shaft out. I'll go over what I use and then the techniques I use, and then I'll be modifying the inner CVs on the two new CVs that I get to not bind on the actual axle shaft itself. And it should be a pretty explanational, it's not even a word, informational video, so follow along. Alright, a couple things that you're going to want when you do this is I use OEM CV boot kits. Also, you got to have your shop dog over here. I'm not sure what he's chewing on, probably something he shouldn't be. And then some sort of mat that you don't care about because this is going to get real greasy. So first things first, if this is a factory clamp, you're going to have to cut it off with a pair of dikes. And then same with this one. If not, go ahead and use your tools, either Phillips or a slotted screwdriver to remove both of those. Once those are off, then you can pop this boot out, push down on this to get it out, and then you can pull this off like that. Get this cleaned up as best you can before you start working on it too much. I shouldn't say necessarily as best you can, because basically all I do is get it good enough to expose this C-clip. And it's not entirely a C-clip, it's kind of a pain in the ass to get off. So get that off. Make sure you set all this stuff to the side. The new boot kits do come with them, but you want to have as much as you can as spares and whatever. And then this tripod slides you right off. Some Tacomas I've worked on, it's a little bit harder to get off than Now we'll get this boot off and slide it all the way off. Alright guys, it is literally like 3 weeks since I started filming this video, so it might be a little bit choppy. The thing we're going to do is get this inner boot off. Literally comes off the same way. So once you pop those off, I just peel it off the boot like that, and then just grab right underneath like that and twist, and it should pop off. If the CV is older, it will be harder to get it to do that for sure. Joint now there's 2 ways, actually 3 ways to get these inner joints apart. Now if you don't have access to all the tools that I have access to between here and work, you are going to be a little bit limited when it comes to rebuilding these. If you've never watched a CV rebuild before, usually you take a pipe, you slide it over this, which I'll demonstrate, you grab onto this end down here, and you hold the pipe down here, you lift the CV up with the pipes on the ground, and you slam it. There's a C-clip up here, and it's designed to, when you do that, it should shatter the C-clip and come up, and then the shaft should come out. What a lot of people don't realize is when you do that, you do still need to take the CV all the way apart to get any of those broken chunks out of there. A lot of people, it's a misconception that these are just pressed in, and they're not. If you're building long travel shafts, this is very important. Have a new shaft, long travel shaft to put in it, or if the one you broke, if it's OEM and the shaft is still good, you can usually pop the C-clip off, slide the inner part of the joint off, and then that shaft is actually still good to use. So if you're doing something like that, what I recommend is coming in as close to the cage as you can, either with a chop saw, hot saw, with a hot saw blade on it, or use a cutoff wheel. If you put the CV at an angle like this, doesn't take much, you can come in, cut halfway, and then go the other way and cut halfway again. Then the shaft is gone. Now obviously that shaft is no longer usable, and then you can actually rotate the joint around, pop the C-clip off, and then you can take the joint apart and take everything apart. If you cut it apart, you do need to make sure that you take it apart, clean it all and everything, because you don't want any of that grit in there. This is one that I cut apart, and I'll explain that in a minute. If you look in here, you can see that mark there, which is actually material taken away from it. You can see it there as well, and then that one you can kind of see both those notches right there and right there. The CV never actually stopped working or broke. I just heard a whole bunch of noise coming from it. I'm assuming because the inner cage was able to move around in here and start binding up more, which is going to eventually start making that worse. This is a third way to take it apart. If you need to save the shaft and you cannot get the shaft out, but the joint is still good, I just threw this in the lathe and then parted it off. You could also do it with a cutoff wheel. It would just be time consuming. So hopefully that will explain a lot of the misconceptions with rebuilding CVs and whatnot. So it's almost been 2 years on the same CVs, front locked with 37s at very low PSI, and they're not even actually broken, they're just worn. And I buy low mile CVs from a junkyard. FJs, 4th gens, and GXs all take the same CV. You can usually get them from anywhere from like 65 to $100 plus tax for an OEM CV. Now, they don't always come in great condition. They can come, the joints might be a little bit rusty, the splines might be a little bit rusty, something like that. I just bead blast them at work, just paint them. So I do that. Mind you, they did last so long, so you could go OEM and you wouldn't be out a ton of money. But 2 OEM shafts is pushing $700, or 2 OEM full CVs is pushing $700. Then you have to take them apart. If you do it properly, you can save the boots and stuff, so you don't have to buy new boots. But then you're in it, $700 to rebuild them, plus your long travel shafts if you're doing it for the first time. This way, I'm, even at $100 a CV, call it $200 plus boot kits, they're like $50 each. So I'm in at $300 to rebuild 2 versus $700 plus grease to rebuild 2. So I'm, less than half the cost of buying brand new. And I feel like I get the same amount of life because most of these are coming out of stock vehicles, and you take them apart and they look brand new inside. They feel great. There's no weird markings or wear or anything like that. Do not use them from a Tacoma. Tacoma ones are completely different. The splines on the outer joints are the same, so you can take a shaft from a CV and put it right into a Tacoma, and vice versa, but you can't take the CV apart and use the long travel FJ shaft in a Tacoma CV and vice versa. And when you're rebuilding these, I know that was kind of long-winded, but I felt like it was a good explanation and make people a little bit more comfortable. If you're rebooting your CVs, it's super easy. Rebooting, basically this process of taking that inner tulip, taking the boot off the outer, taking the boot off the inner, taking the tulip off with that, take that C-clip off, slide the boot off, slide that inner boot off, clean everything up really, really, really good. Buy a Toyota boot kit for it. It's $50, and then you're not going to use all of the grease for the outer tube, obviously, because it still has grease in it. Use about half of the tube. And then for the inner, you're going to put it back together, clean it out as good as you can because you have it apart. So clean all the grease off of it and everything that you can. Put it back together, squirt all the grease in there, tighten the clamps up, and you're good to go. Yes, you do have to buy a $50 boot kit, but an OEM CV is so much better than any of the aftermarket ones you're going to get. The inners on a long travel setup is actually what limits your travel and what causes the CV to bind up. I don't remember the numbers exactly, but I believe an OEM outer will pull almost 32 or 33 degrees or something like that. Outer joints kind of limit themselves to a point. So if you're at full lock and full droop, that's kind of what it's going to look before it starts to bind up. And you can see that it still rolls around just fine, and this joint has issues. So that's how much you get out of the outer joint. Now, the inner joint, factory, and we look at like this joint here that I did, this one I did with a Dremel originally, so it's not great looking, but you can see that all of that material is missing. You can see actually on this shaft right there where it's used to rub on the inner joint. See that light spot? So that's actually rubbing on the inner joint. This was before I figured out this information. For your max angle for your inner joints, about like that versus that. So your inner joint is actually what is your limiting factor here. Now, the inner joint doesn't turn, it just, you know, travels up and down, so it sits like this. All you're getting out of the inner joint is this right here. You're not turning or anything with the inner joint, so it doesn't have to have as much travel. It only has to be able to max out like this. So with the joint, when it's drooped out, the joint plunges, obviously. So with it drooped out, I can now I actually max the joint itself out. So this tripod joint itself can only travel so far. So that is maxing the tripod out, and it barely contacts that. Now I don't get that far when it's actually in the truck. So with those ears being relieved, and this is so close to the frame, obviously, with that, taking that, you know, 3/8 probably out of that diameter, and allowing it to, the axle all the way back here, be able to travel 3/8 more, translates so much more into the actual wheel itself. Now you do run into steering limitations on these with the OEM steering. The joint only allows so much. So with the Tundra tie rods, it allows me to utilize the full travel of the CV without binding, and the tie rod itself gives me way more leeway. So I end up pulling like almost 14 inches of travel out of a 2-inch long travel kit. Always take them all the way down to this, because I can clean the whole thing out, get all the old grease and shit out of there and everything. Just know when you put it back together like this, it's going to be a little bit more difficult because there's no grease or lubrication. This basically just drops back in. Usually have to go from this side, just like that. Do it with one hand. This bigger edge is going to go down, and these cutouts are going to go up. So it's the smaller edge up, and those notches up is the proper orientation of it. These marks and stuff like this on a shaft with some, or on a joint with some miles on it, is no big deal. You'll see those, or those marks there. That's just them basically polishing themselves together. To get it in the joint, take 2 of those openings, line it up, put the first ball in like that, push this stuff back like that. Again, stuff's going to be a little bit tighter now because there's absolutely no grease in there at all. It does become, obviously you can see I'm fighting it, you might have to tap it with a hammer. Better to technically use a brass drift, brass punch, something like that to do it. But these cages and shit is so hard, I've never dented anything using a hammer like this. As you guys saw earlier in a video, I used OEM Toyota boot kits. So it's easy to tell which is the inner and which is the outer. Shorter boot is the inner boot. It's a little bit softer material. Outer boot is a different material and longer. This is your inner grease. This is your outer grease. This is the other style air clamp, which you have to have a special tool for. I've used dikes and been able to close them with that, and it works fine. I like to be able to take the boot off if I need to, and then tighten the clamp back up, so I don't use most of the clamps that they come with. This is the outer CV snap ring thing, and this is the inner CV snap ring thing. If you're rebooting, clean the inner out as good as you can and use the whole tube of grease. For the outer, you're not going to pull the shaft all the way out, so there's no reason to use the whole tube. Clean it off as good as you can, and then put as much grease as you can up around the shaft, and I'll show you how to do that. Alright, take the outer joint. If you have a vise, you can clamp it in a vise, and it makes it a little bit easier. But you have to be really careful not to mark up any of the surfaces. The nut, if I'm not using a vise, I just flip the nut around so you have a decent surface to work on. Bring her up like that. You don't have to poke a hole, it's already all done for you. Stick it down inside here, but you want to fill it just till it starts to come out about halfway up the splines. You can kind of tap it a little bit to get it to bring some more grease down in there, but that's all I do. It'll basically fill that whole cavity down there. For the outer joint, this is the C-clip that you want to use. After it's cut, these are pretty easy to put on. You don't have to like spread them apart or anything, you can just push them on. It's a little bit hard to do around the camera. It goes on just like that. Obviously it's not going to fit in there perfectly because that's the point of it. And then you're going to slide this into here and then start working it down into the splines like that. You'll get it to sit on that ring, and then all you have to do is grab screwdrivers. Usually I use 2 of them. Needle nose plier also works. You can try to squeeze it. Basically, you just need to collapse that ring and push down on the shaft at the same time to get it to go in there. This one was a little bit harder to get than most of the ones that I've done. I just grabbed channel locks and I just put it in there, squeeze it with channel locks, push down. Once it looked like it was most of the way in there, I just took the rubber hammer and knocked on the top of it, and it got it to go most of the way in. You see that shaft just come out and drop back in? That means that the snap ring expanded on the other side, and this joint's just not going to pop back out. That's where you want to make sure you use all the grease you got in this tube. Boot, slide it over. Try not to pick up any grease on your way down. I always try to slide it over the joint before I care about it sitting in the right spot. Just like that. Like that. And then push it down until it pops into place, which is right there. Just like that. All right, now we're moving on to the inner. Pop it down to where it sits in that groove, and then get down as far as you can and start squirting this inner grease in. Have your tulip. Now the tulip only goes on one way. See how that's relieved? So that goes down, just like that. And that inner clip should go on pretty easily. Make sure it's snapped into there properly, just like that. Wipe your greasy little fingers off. Inner grease tube into the joint. Now, you got all this grease in there, so try to pack it down a little bit, because this can get messy. Flip it over. The tulips go in these big openings, so just line it up for that. And it slides on. Don't put this clamp on because you have to rotate the boot to fit the joint properly. And then start working the boot up. This boot's harder to get on the outside here than the outer boot is. Like that, and it'll slide up pretty obviously into that spot. Throw your lower clamp on. This is a 3 to 4 inch clamp, and all the way open, they barely fit. Honestly, doing these CDs is way easier than people say, or people think it is. I recommend just tackling it yourself. Once you do it the first time, it's way easier. I'm sorry this video took so long to finally get out. Hopefully it's got a lot of information in it. Thanks for watching. We have a couple new videos coming up. I'm going to do a full walk around on the truck again, and then I'm also going to do a video talking about what I did to fit 37s and 38s. So share it around. If we get 2,000 subscribers, we might do something a little bit special.